Jackie Doyle-Price, I think we got elected at the same time, 2010.
Yeah, indeed.
2010. Your mum worked at Woolworths. Your dad was a builder's labourer. Not many stories like that in Parliament. Does there need to be more?
Absolutely. I mean, Parliament should really reflect the composition of British society, and I'm afraid for too long it's been full of white, male, middle-class lawyers. And we need a more diverse set of voices. And I think actually one of the reasons that our politics has panned out over the last few years with Brexit, with the change in the red wall, stroke blue wall, whatever you want to call it, is very much because of that. And I think increasingly, thankfully, actually the Conservative Party is having a much more broader based set of voices. And if anything, the Labour Party is becoming more and more metropolitan and middle class.
Do you think your working class heritage, your South Yorkshire accent, do you think it's held you back in politics?
I think it holds you back generally in society, in truth, because our society works for the pointy-elbowed middle classes. I would say actually that my class probably has held me back more than my sex, in truth. But again, I think the more that we are seen to be sort of striking through those glass ceilings, the more we can take people up with us. And ultimately, it should be for everyone to aim high and become the best that they can be. That's real social mobility, actually.
Do you think there's a class ceiling in politics?
Like most professions, you know, like attracts like, doesn't it? And of course, you know, for a game that's been played by historically actually lawyers more than anyone else, there's still a preponderance of them. But you know, increasingly we can break through, and there are some very strong voices. And actually, the people who leave most impact are the ones who are a bit different.
So you grew up in a council house in Sheffield. Your working class parents wanted to buy that council house, and that triggered your interest in politics, I read. Just tell us a bit about that.
I did. So I was about 14. So as you'll recall, that's when we start to get a bit agitated about the things that are happening around us, and a bit angry. Yeah, my parents wanted to buy their council house, and at that time, Sheffield always has been a very Labour area, and it was led by David Blunkett, who at that time was very seen as one of the left-wing firebrands. He's less so these days, actually, much more centrist. But yeah, I mean, the Labour Party were ideologically opposed to selling off council housing, so they did everything they could to make that more difficult. And it just pricked an interest in me. I thought, you know, I've been taught here that the Labour Party is for the party of the working classes, yet here are my parents working hard, trying to do the right thing, wanting to better themselves, and the Labour Party are getting in their way, and it's the Conservative Party that's offering them that opportunity. And so with that sort of pricked interest, that's when I started to properly explore politics more, and there was no turning back for me. I've been a Conservative campaigner ever since.
And you've also been a close friend of Liz Truss for a long time, 25 years?
Yes, more than half our lives. So yes, yeah, I met Liz after she graduated from university, and we were both involved in Greenwich politics at the time for the Conservative Party.
The London area, South London area. Yeah. Is there anything we don't know about Liz Truss?
There's actually lots you don't know about Liz Truss, because actually she's a very private person, and what you've all seen is the politically driven Liz Truss, but privately she's a very warm and thoughtful friend with a very tight family. And yeah, I mean, I would say I've been privileged to call her a friend for very many years.
I've just read one of the biographies of Liz Truss, well, the biography of Liz Truss, Out of the Blue. She likes a Sauvignon Blanc.
Well, don't we all like a Sauvignon Blanc? Well, she's a human being, and again, I think this one of the difficulties is that, you know, our politics, you know, the way we report our politics is very aggressive. It doesn't actually give you much of an opportunity to be a personality, in truth. And in Liz's case, you know, she's been at the top of her game for more than 10 years. She's served in the cabinet all that time. And the truth is, I don't think people have seen very much of her. So yeah, everyone sort of grabs these things like, oh, she likes a Sauvignon Blanc. Well, doesn't everyone like a glass of wine? I think
Chardonnay in my case. Yeah, indeed. I don't know if, I think while I was in Parliament, while we were in Parliament together, I think politics is, people really don't like politics and politicians. Do you have any, it's a big question this, any solutions, or do you get why politics and politicians are not trusted, liked? You seem like a feet on the ground sort of woman. That's why I'm asking you.
I mean, if we look at what's happened in the last 2 weeks, where Sky have produced their Westminster accounts, which has taken what's publicly available information but packaged it in a way as to imply that members of Parliament are all on the take. And, I sat and watched that and I just thought, this is really irresponsible because actually, you and I have sat in Parliament. Most of our colleagues are good, honourable people who just want to do better for society. And yet most of the reporting that we ever see, both in broadsheets and on TV, is trying to imply that we're all crooks, we're all crooked, we're all on the make. And it just isn't true. But I think that well has been poisoned since the expense scandal, when actually what was a cynical attempt in long before you and I were in Parliament, was instead of giving MPs a decent pay rise, oh no, just get it all on expenses. It was a cynical act to hide it from public view, but it's poisoned politics for good. And I actually just wish that we all collectively realise in society that actually our politicians in this country are pretty good. We're actually quite lucky. And if we don't recognise that, we are actually diminishing the importance of politics. Because the truth is, what we have to do in Parliament in terms of holding the government to account, in terms of making good quality legislation, it is important work. And if good people are put off because they're always going to be accused of all kinds of things from doing that job, then we'll attract people who don't have those motives, and our law will be worse for it. I mean, I just think, we as politicians also have to be a lot more confident about saying what we believe, rather than saying what we think will play. So I'm sick of hearing about focus groups. Margaret Thatcher never bothered with focus groups because she knew what she wanted to do, and we shouldn't be landing things like that. If we always operate in the national interest, which I think broadly we do, we'll get these things right, and we should be honest with the public about them. We shouldn't be just diverted by amplifying messages just because Nigel Farage has said something, or a trade union leader said something else. Stick to what's right, and the public will trust us.
Very interesting. I want to talk to you about a speech you made in Parliament in December. It was about violence against women and girls. It was a very interesting speech. So I wanted to... There's a few things that I pulled out. We too often approach these issues from the perspective of the pointy-elbowed middle classes, and the most vulnerable in our society are left behind. Just to expand on that a little bit.
I think that's true of all our public services, actually. If you take something like the NHS, the NHS when it was conceived was all about making sure that people got access to the healthcare they needed, that it wasn't dependent on income. It was all about making sure that we had vaccines and we had, tackling disease, because, in the early part of this century, people did die from poor living conditions. And that's how the NHS was conceived. And over time, our health has changed over time in any case, but so have the demands we've placed on it. And it is very much about making sure that we're satisfying the demands that people lobby for. And the fact is that some people are better at lobbying than others. And inevitably then, that starts to distort, how things are allocated. So you see it in health. The idea that, when we created the NHS, which was all about, lifting people out of poverty and making sure that disease didn't kill, that we're actually now allocating resources for things like IVF, for all kinds of operations that you would never have even thought about as being life or death, if you like. Similarly with education, you've got, we've all seen how, your postcode affects the quality of education that you get. And ultimately, a system will react to those that shout loudest, and that is the pointy-elbowed middle classes. And in terms of violence against women and girls, if you look at our prisons, most of our women in prison have been victims of sexual violence. And we look back at things like Rotherham and so on, and for me, it feels like there is what you might euphemistically call an underclass, which more colloquially is referred to as chavs, which again is symptomatic of the snobbery that exists. And I think that our society, our political systems, just don't treat those people as fairly as they ought to. Our intervention as politicians, as providers of public services, should be about levelling those people up, not satisfying the middle class who shout loudest.
Interesting. I just want to, just for the point of clarity, because I don't want you to get stick if it's been misinterpreted. You said things like IVF. That's reasonable that the NHS provides IVF.
It's entirely reasonable.
I just wanted to clear that for your benefit.
It's an example. But I mean, I could say something like tattoo removal, right, for that matter, or even straightening your teeth. Yeah. These aren't life or death issues. They are good things for the National Health Service to be doing, absolutely. But in terms of where we put our priorities, they aren't necessarily, if we're looking at waiting lists for things like, cancer operations and so on, let's get these things correct.
Okay. Another line from your speech: we are seeing sex offenders self-identifying as women and being able to enter women's prisons. We had a rape only very recently. That has to be tackled. How?
Well, there are risk assessments in terms of who's allocated to a women's prison. The difficulty for me is that when they're making that risk assessment, it is the risks pertaining to that individual who's chosen to self-identify as a woman, which are that's the prison through which it's addressed, not the potential risks to the women in the prison to whom they're joining. And there was a recent sex assault where the person had been risk assessed but still went on to cause issues within that facility. I mean, for me, we've just got to get all this right. We need to centre women at the part of this debate, really, because absolutely we should be kind to people. Absolutely we should allow people to live as they wish. But where that poses a risk to women, then that needs to be properly managed. And I think the whole debate about self-ID isn't centering women enough. There is a conflict of rights here, and we need to have tools for managing that. And at the moment, it's too much about rhetoric and talk of rights. And again, women come second place in all of these things. It's centering the men who are choosing to identify as women and not the women themselves.
Are you a feminist?
I never used to define myself as a feminist. I thought that the battles of feminism were over. Growing up in the 1980s, all women's lib had happened. I was able to benefit from that. But I increasingly find that actually, we still live in a patriarchal system, and the interests of men will always trump those of women if we let them. So I suppose the short answer to that is yes, I am. I didn't expect to have to be.
Final point from the speech, which as I say, I found really interesting. I will not be happy until someone engaged in sex work who is murdered receives as much attention as a nice, pretty middle-class girl.
Well, again, we're back to classes of victim here. It was very striking that when, Wayne Couzens was arrested, was convicted for the murder and abduction, that absolutely changed the game, really, because it made people wake up to realise that anyone could be a victim. But the truth is, Gloria, as you and I know, prostitutes disappear every week and no one pays a blind bit of notice. And the truth is that, violence against women and girls is never acceptable. And, women don't choose to go into sex work. It's something that happens to vulnerable women. It happens to women who often are persuaded to, coerced into doing it by men who live off them. And I think, again, we need to properly start tackling these issues, because at the moment, it's too easy to look the other way when these things are on, because if it doesn't affect you, if you've got your nice house with enough money coming in and everything's happy with you, it's easy to ignore what's happening around the corner. You just make sure that you don't go down there when it's not a nice place to live. And I'm afraid there are still too many vulnerable women who are being exploited by men, and that's something we need to tackle.
Thoroughly enjoyed that. Found it really interesting, a really complex set of opinions. Politicians are often pigeonholed, but I feel like we've learned a lot more about what you think, and I feel better for it, wiser for it. So thank you, Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you.